Today, our guest is Rob Skiff, founder and CEO of 3852.ai. We'll talk about that one later, which is a company that creates combination therapies for hard-to-treat diseases using predictive artificial intelligence, automated design of experiments, and robotics. A lesser-known fact about Rob is that he's also founded the Vermont Common School, something, again, we will discuss later, but also very interesting. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Thanks, Jacob. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you and share a little bit about what we're doing at 3852.
Excellent. So a few core topics that we'll cover in this week's episode are AI and how we're just scratching the surface, especially with what Rob deals with, but also topics such as diversity, and not just in the commonly used terms. We're also talking about diversity in both the available genetic data, which is something I had no idea about. So that'll be an exciting topic for many. And also, of course, diversity in building teams and growing companies. So Rob, when it comes to diversity, what are the core principles that you're following in your business to make sure that you're getting the right sort of diversity that's going to help you build a great company long term?
So you really have to build diversity by, in some ways, not thinking about diversity. You basically need to have developed over the course of your life a wide variety of people from different backgrounds, races, and experiences. And then as you're building a company or working on new projects, you pull from that network. And you pull from that network to fill in your blind spots, the areas that you may not have experience with. And what you generally find is excellence and intelligence and experience are evenly distributed across the planet. And so what you do is you just tap into your network and you pull the best. And when you pull the best from your network, you're inevitably going to have a group that's representative of humanity as a whole. At 3852, Norman Packard is older than I am by about 10 years, has a very different set of experiences in terms of spending a bunch of time in Italy, and his wife is Italian, but he grew up Presbyterian in the Southwest in Navajo country. And I met him, and we've got a very different background and set of experiences in life. Then when I met Colin Walter, who I've known now for almost 16 years, he's married to one of my best friends from college. And Colin's got an amazing background in recruitment. He's worked for Microsoft, Amazon in HR. He's also worked for a bunch of game studios. Now, Colin grew up in Queens, New York, but his family is from Antigua. And so he's got a different set of experiences. He's a much better lacrosse player than I was growing up. And when I introduced him to Norman, the team gelled really well. And finally, with Dana Reed, Dana's an unkept gem in the financial world. She was one of the first associates hired by JP Morgan. She's a graduate of Howard University, an African-American who grew up in St. Louis. And she's also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and does a lot of investment work in Africa. I actually met Dana on a fishing pier in Sag Harbor, Long Island. She was fishing with her two sons, and I was with my two boys, and she was having a hard time in terms of navigating putting the bait on the hook, and hadn't been fishing much with her kids. And so we just all got together and started fishing off this pier, caught about 10, 15 fish. And then at the end, we were like, hey, how are we going to cook these up? And I said, I'm staying at my friend Colin and Michelle's just up the street. And she knew them. You can always, if you are open and you cultivate a network with people who are from different backgrounds and parts of the world than you are, then when you get involved in projects, you can pull from that network and do some amazingly extraordinary things. I don't have any experience in terms of the focus that some companies do in terms of trying to create, we need a certain amount of people from this background, a certain amount of people from this. We just basically develop things organically. And now 3852 has the highest percentage of African Americans in terms of a biotechnology company on the board of directors. Both Dana and Colin are members of the board. Ownership, they own a substantial part of the company. And also Dana as a board member and CFO, there are very few companies in biotech that have women in the C-suite. in positions of leadership. And we didn't do that by recruitment. We did that by drawing upon the network and our friends and building it organically. And that's what we intend to do in the future.
So would you say that gives you thought diversity as well, having so many different types of experiences all over the world, but also culturally and various other ways, that thought diversity contributes to a better, more successful company?
Yeah, absolutely. All of us have lived and worked outside the United States. I was a teacher down in Ecuador. I've done work in terms of educational exchanges in China. I've done some minor trips and consulting out in Europe. Dana has done a ton of work in Africa and also the US, Colin in Europe, Canada. So yeah, when you have people who are comfortable working cross-culturally outside their own culture, you're going to get thought diversity, and you're going to be able to solve problems that you might not, that more traditional companies that focus just on, let's say, North Americans or Europeans have. So it really helps us out.
Now, where does the name 3852 come from?
So 3852, Colin and I both have a close friend who was diagnosed with having the marker for triple negative breast cancer and she was told that at 38. And she eventually did develop cancer, and then at the age of 52 was cancer free. And so what we wanted to do is we came up with a name. We were thinking about combination drug treatments. What we want to do is make sure that if she ever develops cancer again, that we have a combination treatment for her. And so that's why we call it 3852 AI. So yeah, that's the name.
It's very meaningful. And when you're talking about these combination therapies, it's not the standard thing to be thinking about. How do we treat these hard to treat diseases? When everyone came together, and you're saying the environment and the community and everybody gelled, how did this just arise? You had that experience with her, and then it was like, hey, let's start a company, or take us through some of that.
Yeah. Okay. So the different people have arrived at coming to 3852, but really we need to recognize that the work of Norman Packard in artificial intelligence and synthetic biology is really the foundation of the company. He's a genius, okay? And he hates it when I call him that. But when I first met Norman, I met him as part of a group that was working on a synthetic biology project in Europe. And I first met him in Chicago at a meeting. But interestingly enough, that's when I physically met him, okay, in the person. But I had actually heard about Norman Packard through work that I was doing back in the year 2000 in creating computer models for foreign exchange trading. And Norman Packard created a group called the Prediction Group. And he's had a couple of books written about him. I think a Netflix special is going to be coming up on that. And he developed the first artificial intelligence programs connected to options and stock trading and that group was very successful and was eventually bought by UBS back in the early 2000s. And Norman then went and did work in Europe on this group called Protocells, which is basically doing things in synthetic biology to create basically a programmable life form. And he was connected with a guy named Steen Rasmussen. Now, Steen and Norman, in my mind, are like it's hanging out with Donatello and Leonardo da Vinci. You're talking about two people who really are foundational thinkers in synthetic biology and protocells, whose work is going to have an amazing impact in the latter half of the 21st century. So when I met Norman at this meeting, and it was actually in Chicago, he was making a presentation on the protocells, and it didn't click in my mind that this was the Norman Packard who I had based the work off of until I was at my computer and I was like, okay, I'm going to Google Norman Packard. And I looked him up on Wikipedia and then saw the Prediction Group. And then I was like, oh my God, So when at this meeting they were organizing some particular things, and Norman and I weren't a part of that thing they were organizing. And so we went down to the bar and had a drink and talked about the Foundation trilogy and by Asimov and computer modeling and all of that. And eventually I was asked to work with Norman on his company that he created called Daptics. Now, Daptics is a company where Norman's developed predictive artificial intelligence, okay? And that is using AI to do what's called design of experiments, which is to basically guide an experimental search for a particular type of answer in a very large possible space. So for example, he's done work in protein optimization. So protein optimization, formulation, now combination drug treatments. These are very large possible combinations of answers, okay? You have a large searchable space. So in our case, 2.4 billion possible combinations of drugs that you have to search for to find the best 10 or 15. Now, you can't run 2.4 billion possible combinations economically to find a combination drug treatment. You have a limited experimental bandwidth. And so what the AI does is it guides and it tells you, run these experiments, okay? Run 100 of them. And then that data from that experiment goes back into the AI, and the AI says, okay, now that you've run these experiments, run these 100 experiments and search this area of the possible space. And so eventually you think about it as climbing a mountain to the best answer. And so instead of having to search all those combinations, you can find great answers with an experimental bandwidth of 20,000 experiments or so. It depends on what you're looking at. So Norman's basically created a program that is a supercharged graduate student that can see connections in the data that human beings can't. They can't grok it, and even intuition isn't going to work. This is high-level math. Norman's background is in physics, and he's been working on these types of prediction problems since the start of his career at the prediction group and through his work with synthetic biology, et cetera. So maybe I went off, maybe that's a little bit too like mealy, and we can try again when we're a little bit more warmed up. I can make it a little shorter for you.
That was great. You know, what comes to mind is, as a CEO, what's your experience working with these amazing people like Norman, who might have definitely has extreme expertise, knowledge, etc. The different words there are to keep on going, but how do you as a CEO really guide and lead the team towards your goals and towards your initiatives? So
the first thing is you recruit the best, and then you let the best people do their thing, okay? There's two things. I look at it at the role of a CEO. I was trained as a teacher, okay? And I was trained as a teacher in a school that was very project-based. And we would come up with the students and I would come up with these projects like a carbon sequestration project or some computer modeling issues, some complex thing. And what we would do is we would break into particular sections to answer these questions or create one doing with how much carbon finding out how much carbon can a tree extract from the air. And what you do is you allow the people to guide themselves and do their thing. And you also have to protect them, okay? Protect them meaning make sure they've got the resources they need, make sure that they've got the support that they need to do their work, and always motivating and pointing in the particular direction of where you want to go. The goal of 3852 is to find right now a combination of 5 to 7 combination drug treatment for cancer. Norman has amazing skills, both in computer modeling, but he's also an amazing scientist and manager. It's not too difficult to say, hey, Norman, we need a simulation on X, Y, and Z. And Norman will take some time to create it or bring us in. He asked me, hey, Rob, I need research on particular cell lines or libraries of drugs. Colin, how do we find these particular individuals to do something for us? You basically set a goal, you protect the people who you're working for, you make sure they have the resources, and you constantly, you have to be humble, you have to dispense with ego, and you constantly have to protect. You have to bring out the best in your team, and those are skills that I had to learn as a teacher. So I actually think that those skills of teaching and education have been really valuable for management, because when I'm dealing with lawyers, scientists, or finance people, each one of those groups speaks a different language. That's exactly like working with elementary school kids with different learning styles. You just have to be able to bridge the gap, make sure that they're focused on the particular issues that they need to be, that they're collaborating across the discipline, and don't try to control, try to set things up so that they can do their best, and also give people the freedom to try new things and to be wrong. Okay. There have been some things that we've tried that haven't worked. You can't punish people for being wrong. Okay. You have to create an environment where taking chances, trying new things is something that's encouraged. Otherwise, you're not going to find a really good solution to the problems that you're dealing with, whether it's personnel, whether it's finance, or whether it's a scientific problem.
So to push that back the other way, looking at, say, the Vermont Commons School, have you applied that sort of entrepreneurial thinking, right, that I would call your Silicon Valley? It's, hey, failure is good. It means you're going for something, things that matter. Failure means you're learning. How can we bring that more into education in a space where you have A, B, C, D, E?
I guess I'm going to be a little cynical, because I now tell, when people, I just ran into a former student today, and they were like, Rob, what are you doing? And I explained, and they were like, wow, that's a big switch. And I said, well, remember, Kyle, it's easier to cure cancer than it is to reform education. Okay. I'm not quite sure whether or not today we've created a culture in our schools where trying new things and failing and innovation is really encouraged, because there are a lot of constraints, especially in public education, versus in terms of the emphasis on test scores, the emphasis on particular curricular subjects, the politics that is happening in terms of schools right now. So I think it's very difficult. When I started with my dad and my ex-wife, Vermont Common School, we tried all kinds of different things. Some things absolutely didn't work. And we were always telling the kids, hey, that didn't move. That did not work, did it? And they would go, yeah. And so we modeled the behavior that we wanted to create in kids. There were some times when I would come up with, I'd spend so much time on a particular lecture or an activity, and then I would do it with the students, and it fell flat on its face. And rather than forcing them to finish it, I looked at them and I said, that's not working, is it? And they would be like, no, it's not really, Rob. And then you say, okay, I'll come up with something new. Let's change the course. And that modeled the behavior that they could also try new things, and that I wasn't going to get ticked off at them for not giving me the answer that I wanted. Okay. I wanted them to develop their ability to move through, and like Dewey, to learn by doing and learn through experimentation, which is really where creativity and innovation always comes from.
So would you say that there are counter incentives in the general school system now for encouraging that sort of thinking or bringing innovation into education? And are some of the newer things that have come up as per, let's say, COVID, a lot of changes occurred in education and everywhere in life. Are those some of the perhaps seedlings to the answer, or is it something where, there's going to be a leading model that needs to be really proven, thoroughly brought out? I mean, in your intuition, what would you say was going to bring the greatest change in education?
I'm pretty sanguine about what we're going to see in education the next 10 years. There's a lot of innovation that's happening on the homeschool front, where parents are taking charge of their kids' education, and they're using things like Khan Academy different online resources. Parents have the ability now really to educate their own children at an incredibly high level that we didn't have 30 years ago. Schools, it's really hard when most of the teachers that are teaching grew up in the 20th century rather than being part of the 21st. If you really want to be an innovative teacher, I think it's a young person's game. And one of the problems right now is we have teachers who become teachers in their 20s. Their degrees are generally in education rather than in a discipline like math, science, social science, history. And those teachers come in and they do it for 5, 10, maybe 12 years, and then they move on to something else. Okay. Right now we have a system where a teacher gets hired, and if they're a public school teacher, they're there for their entire career at that particular school. Maybe they move from one or two places. That's not healthy at all. You have to be exposed to new ideas. You have to get out in the real world. I loved my time teaching, but I was good for, most teachers I think are good for maybe 15 years. Then they need to move on and do something else, because you have to have the new ideas that are influencing your thought and your education and your teaching. I think when you're young, you're really good at being open and innovative, but I'm not too impressed with older teachers. There are some amazing older teachers, don't get me wrong, but the average innovation needs to happen constantly in education. And if our teachers aren't innovative, then we're not really preparing the next generation. We're preparing these kids in school today for a world that existed in the early 2000s, maybe. We're not preparing them for the world that exists today. And that is a major problem, and why I think we're seeing a lot of the problems in our schools and in education today. You know, we're not engaging kids or creating the skills that they need to succeed in the 21st century. And that is math, science, computer modeling, English, history, philosophy, and a foreign language. Most kids do not learn a foreign language when they're in school. Most students don't know really how to do computer modeling, whether it's in terms of a thing called system dynamics or basic programming. Our math skills are not that great. And when I talk about history, I'm not talking about learning just US history. I'm talking about an understanding of the dynamics of population, the environment, and culture, on how groups change and evolve over time. I've just found that it's much more, whether it's on the left or the right, ideologically driven, and that has a big impact on our companies and our science and how we're thinking and working, again, cross-culturally with the entire planet. And yeah, I could go on and on about that one.
Yeah, it's an excellent topic, and one that's very important. There needs to be more conversations that are pollinated with diverse experiences going into education. And you mentioned a bit there about college. What about student loans? You mentioned that having a crazy impact on the economic growth as a whole. And of course, we can talk about college as a system as well as an extension of early education. But what about student loans really has driven economic growth?
Interestingly enough, even though I'm working in AI and in robotics to create these combination drug treatments, my graduate degrees we're very interdisciplinary, and I have an EDD, doctorate in education for policy and leadership studies from UVM. And one of the major papers I wrote with a guy named Scott Baker was a paper on the effect of student loans on economic growth and outcomes. Now, this was written in 2008, okay? Or actually it was 2009. And we all thought that the price of college wasn't going to be able to increase anymore, because the servicing on the student loans was just going to be impossible. That people would recognize that the value of the degrees that they were receiving was actually not going to increase their the money that you earned over your lifetime. And I think for a lot of the STEM and the engineering fields, that's correct. But for philosophy and history, I love them. I got my degree in 1990. If I were to, there's no way I would spend 80,000 a year to study history and Buddhism like I did back at Middlebury when it was Middlebury College when it was 15,000. So this student loan debt, so schools give particular merit aid, but kids and their families have to take out loans to pay for the tuition for these particular degrees. And what happens is they graduate with a degree in a subject area where they're not going to be able to find a job to service that debt. Okay. And so what it does is it eliminates their ability to save. So they can't, for example, come up with the money to buy a house. They can't come up with the money sometimes to live outside of their parents' home, or even live with another person who they would like to establish a romantic relationship and then eventually create a family, however you want to constitute that family. And all of those particular things are really the biggest lodestone for young people is the student debt. And for most, you're seeing less and less men going to an undergraduate education. Right now, I think it's 60% of undergraduate students are women, 40% are men. You're finding men checking out of higher ed. They're still dominant in STEM fields and math and science, but a lot of the fields you won't see men there. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem for everybody because you need more of a 50-50 balance. Okay. And right now there isn't a balance at all. And I think a lot of that is being driven by debt and by the really bad economic position that both men and women find themselves at the end of a 4-year program with degrees that can't service the debt that they've taken out.
What other paths then are people taking by the data, and what would it be like if there was more of that 50-50 split again? Not to mention another topic we could talk about, student loans being more, or student education in college being more affordable. But what about those two topics about rebalancing and
So I actually don't know whether you need to go to college for a couple different fields. For example, if you're a computer programmer, you can place your portfolio on GitHub. And if I'm looking for a Python programmer, I can go on GitHub, and really all I'm interested in is looking at your code. Okay. I'm looking, and the number of videos and groups that are out there to teach coding or to teach CS is huge. So there are some really amazing disciplines where people don't necessarily have to go to college to get a degree in that discipline. I also think that economically, there's a huge need for the trades, which are highly technical now: plumbing, electricians, carpenters, builders. All of those are really going to be using computer-aided design, robots. You really need some incredibly sophisticated skills, and you can get your license without having to go get a 4-year degree. When I talk to my sons about, or I talk with any young person, but sometimes I do some college advising about what path to take. I say, look, many of the things that you want to do, you may not need to go to college to get that done. You have to create a portfolio. Why go to college to be an artist when you can apprentice yourself to the artist that you like? Why my son is doing film and biology. Okay. He's already starting to get gigs to do different work in video production and editing, et cetera. That's going to end up being more valuable to him than the classes that he takes in that subject. That's my opinion. Okay. He might kill me if he hears this. So it kind of it all depends. I think we've made the college degree an experience for socialization rather than something practical that's going to get you the skills that you need to get a job or form a company. That's the other particular thing, is that the gig economy and the economics is completely different than it was 50 years ago. We have companies, and there are tons of small businesses, tons of startups that people are forming. And that is a completely different model than, for example, when the 70s, when you graduated with a degree in engineering, you wanted to go to work for GE, IBM, or Ford Motor Company. That's just not the case anymore. I like the fact Elon Musk said, I don't care whether you went to a college or not. I'm going to look at what skills you have, and we'll figure out whether you can work at Tesla or SpaceX. Graduate degrees are important, but really for a very narrow number of disciplines. I never go by Dr. Skiff. I don't feel that I learned my degree that I earned, my graduate degree, my doctorate, doesn't really have a lot of value or use with what I'm doing now. I'm not so sure the skills that I was being taught were really relevant to what good leadership is today in 2020. I think it would be great if at one time I wanted to get a tenure track job in education. I'm so glad that did not work out for a variety of different reasons. But I don't think I made the best choice by going back to get that doctorate in my early 40s. So I guess if anyone is listening out there, don't bother. Don't go get your EDD unless you have to, because that's what you need to go work at a university. But even then, I don't think it's really a worthwhile activity.
So someone in that state, let's say they're listening to this, what would you recommend then? And to connect it to 3852 again, what are some of the thinking processes or frameworks that you're using that are most relevant, that are most valuable, that perhaps you learned in education or otherwise?
So in terms of when you're talking about framework, are you talking about framework in terms of people that I want to recruit to the team, or people, or just frameworks in general?
In the day-to-day frameworks presently, and then you could expand on that of who would you be looking to add on the team, which could give some good insight to how teams grow. Let's say you guys are focusing on solving a specific problem. What are the certain check boxes or frameworks that you are working towards to implement to make sure you're making the right decisions and staying accurate?
You have to look at an individual skill. Okay. Now, there are some areas where a degree is still very important. Okay. Applied mathematics, certain very high level CS work. There are very few people who are doing the work that Norman does. And a bunch of those people are at a university getting a PhD. There are a few, and that laboratory work are extremely important, and an academic background where you really know the biology is important. Graduate work, sciences, super important to have that advanced degree. But in terms of the management or recruitment, the sell side, it becomes a skills and experience and creativity. Degrees in the schools you went to are shortcuts. Okay, they're really cheats to try to figure out the quality of the individual if you're, dare I say it, lazy. Okay, because we all know people there are a few institutions where you get introduced and they mention the school they went to within the first 4 or 5 sentences. Okay, and then you find it out a little bit later on that they really can't think themselves out of a paper bag. Okay, what you want to do is you want to develop the ability to clearly identify the skills you're looking at for a job, and then cast as wide a net as possible to find those people with those types of skills. And today it becomes a lot more difficult because many of the skills, like for example, you've got to learn how to work remotely. Okay, working remotely is actually something that gamers are really good at. Okay. So if I find someone and I'm talking with them and I find they've checked out all the particular knowledge base, their knowledge base is excellent, but then I'll try to ask them about, hey, are you playing Elden Ring right now? Or are you playing some computer games? What did you play when you were younger? And you get to see whether they're thinking outside the box all the time. Okay. Whether they know how to work remotely, whether they're self-starting, whether they're independent. Even if they're, let's say, you also want a little of quirkiness. They don't have to be completely polished. You want people who are comfortable taking some chances, who might have a really crazy, wild hobby. All of those things allow you to see whether they are adaptable, whether they can roll with the punches, whether they can have initiative by themselves. I actually think I was at a conference at unnamed college in the Northeast, and their biggest concern was the fact that their graduates were not very resilient. And probed a little bit, and I found that these kids had gotten into this school, and it was really prestigious, but the kids that they were admitting had to be perfect from 8th grade on. Okay. They went to the right middle school, the right high school. They did all the correct things to check the boxes. And then when they finally arrived at college, they were surrounded by people who were just as good as they were. And so instead of being the top dog, and instead of having a direct path of, okay, you want to do X, here are the steps to go. Most of isn't contained in a guidebook. There are no directions. And so they could not cope with not being told what to do. And their resiliency wasn't there. And so you actually have to find those people who are outside the box. Homeschoolers are phenomenal. Kids from Waldorf, kids who have had a non-traditional childhood. Maybe they grew up and things were not great at home. Maybe all kinds of different places where people have to be creative to survive. Those are the people you want on your team. And those are the people that you have to look for, because maybe they're not quite as polished. Maybe they don't have the skills on the paper, but they have that key ingredient that you need for your team, which is being innovative, being thoughtful. And if you're loyal to them, they'll be incredibly loyal to you. That's what I look for. Someone who's different from me. I don't want to surround myself with people who are like me. I want people who are different, because if we're different, then we're going to be able to see things. They're going to see the things that I'm blind to. And then we're going to have a much better time adapting to this world around us.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the genetic diversity on that exact topic, to really start to focus on 3852 and how we're going to solve cancer and what that timeline is looking like, if we know it all, to take that one step at a time there. Let's really focus in on that genetic diversity. What is the present state, and where does it need to be to move us to a more successful place in creating these combination therapies?
Okay, so let's talk about genetic diversity in terms of research. Okay. Most of the cell lines and research materials that we have that are used in medical research are generally from Northern and Southern Europeans. If you take a look at the big database is the Broad database of cell lines in cancer. If you're developing treatments and you're only testing them on a very limited percentage of humanity, you're not going to get the best possible results. Now, as human beings, we're 99.999% the same, okay? But those little genetic differences have a huge impact down the road with second and third order effects. And so when we're developing drugs and we're trying to find new treatments, if we don't use cell lines that are representative of humanity as a whole, we're not going to have the best treatments. And we're not going to be able to develop the best treatments for everybody. That's a huge issue. It's also a really big issue. A lot of drugs are initially developed and licensed, and they're studying 8 cell lines. Okay. That's not a large number. And they'll license a drug and then it'll go through particular kinds of discovery, preclinical, clinical trials. And there are so few there. A couple of years ago, I was shocked to read there were only two South Asian cell lines in that were used in breast cancer research. There are very limited numbers used of people from Africa. And when you think about it, we actually should be using African cell lines because that is those are where humanity came from. So they're probably closest to what all of us are, rather than just concentrating on Northern and Southern Europeans. We have to increase the genetic diversity of cell lines. It's a huge issue. And it's really important to do that. But what we also have to do is we have to do it in an ethical fashion, because there have been times in history where genetic information has been taken from people and those groups haven't benefited from that. And that's another thing we're working on. And hopefully in a couple months, we can have another discussion about that. And I'll bring on a guest who you'll absolutely love to chat with, because we're really concerned both with the genetic diversity and also the issue of who benefits from someone's genetics. Okay. And the people who should in some ways benefit from that genetics are the people who are donating their cells, donating their tumor cells, et cetera, for this research. They should receive something for it. Either they or the country or the group they're from should get something for that. Rather than what happens now is it's donated and then it goes off into the ether, and then someone makes a ton of money. Someone or some company makes a ton of money off of those cell lines, and that's not okay. Not in our mind anyway.
And what is it the root to the heart cause to that lack of genetic diversity? Is it lack of programs or businesses or companies that have gone after to solve this problem, or what would it be exactly, and how could it be solved?
There are a couple of really amazing companies that are now doing this kind of work in a really ethical fashion. One of them is called 54 Gene. It's an amazing company. It's based in Nigeria, and they're creating a biobank of African genetic material and using it for all kinds of different research. I think what we have to do is there aren't a lot of companies doing that work. What has to happen is, this is where cross-cultural communication and business ethics play a really huge role. Since a lot of biotech companies, both in the US and Europe, are dominated by Europeans, they don't necessarily have the contacts and the experience and the ability to go and to go to these countries and go to these communities. And there's not a lot of trust to provide the samples and create that type of an open, transparent, ethical organization. It's just going to take new protocols. It's going to take countries and leaders, medical leaders in those countries, to basically stand up to what can sometimes be some unethical practices by both multinationals and or NGOs when they get involved with trying to sample the genetics of a population.
And what is that process like?
The process to get permission?
The process to actually sample the genetic information, collect it and store it.
The process involves, so you go to a hospital. Okay, there are protocols centered around collecting human tissue samples. And every country has its own, there are some international standards, but every country has its own laws that govern that. And it's really complex, and countries are, of course, very protective of the genetic material of their population. So you end up having to negotiate with both governments and government ministers, and you have to develop a level of trust. But I think those questions, give us 2 or 3 months and we can really dive into that with a real expert in that area. And I can probably get that person to come on and talk with you.
Perfect.
That'd be a cool conversation to have.
Absolutely. Now I want to continue to focus back on 3852 and the vision and the plan and the goal there. In our first conversation and on your website, it says that you measure success. Your KPI really is the number of lives saved. How are you making progress towards that each day? And what is our outlook for the complete fruition of your goal?
So right now we're looking at running experiments with one cell line. And that's a pilot project. And I can't name the particular cell line we're going to use, but that's on the Broad database. And we're going to create the first 7 to 9 combination drug treatment for that cell line. Now, after that is done, we have to run it with 7 others. And then when you have 8 of these cell lines, then we will license it to a big drug company. But right now, in terms of where we're at as a company, the AI is done, the work protocols and all of that are completed. We've got an agreement with a couple of what are called contract research organizations to do this experimentation, to do these experiments. What we're doing right now is raising some funds to get that project completed. And that's fun too, because you not only have to raise funds, you have to be very particular about who you're getting those funds from. Okay. Because you want people to be in this for the right reasons and for the long term. And so we're really excited about the people we're bringing on board and the ability to get this completely off the ground and starting the running of the experiments sometime in the next 3 to 5 months, which
Excellent.
is great.
And how much are you raising?
So,
right. Yeah.
But if you're interested and you're an accredited investor, you can shoot me an email and we can talk.
Perfect.
I can tell a little bit about, I will say it's fascinating to work in the biotech sector in a field that hasn't really been touched. Okay, so we're developing, again, the first 7 to 9 combination drug treatment. It's never been attempted. We know we can do it. We've run experiments in silico, and now we're just going to spend some money and run these experiments in vivo with live cells. It's a very different model and a very different approach than what pharma companies are used to. Pharma companies usually try to develop a brand new drug targeting novel, what's called mechanism of action. Think of it as a target on a cancer cell that if they hit that target, the cancer cell may be destroyed.
Mm.
The problem is that sometimes the targets work, sometimes they don't. And what we're doing is we're painting many targets on a cancer cell through these combinations. And so we're attacking it from multiple different angles. And there hasn't been the ability to do, whether it's to do the experiments themselves or to find the combinations until really the last 2 or 3 years. And then it's only been the last 2 years that there have been robots really capable of doing this work. And it's only been in the last year or so that there have been really well-established what are called contract research organizations with robotics that can partner with a company like ours to run the experiments so we don't have to spend $10 million to create the infrastructure before we even get started. And that's the exciting thing. When I first was working on 3852 and Norman and I were doing some modeling, we knew we could come up with a combination treatment and it was going to cost about 150 million. Now that still is 10 times cheaper than what it costs to develop a novel therapy, which is about $1.2 billion. Okay?
Wow.
But who's going to give us 150 million to run these experiments on genetically engineered rats? Okay. Then we found a great company who could build a robotic platform for us to run these experiments, and that was $10 million. But that's still really tricky to get 10 million for a startup before there's any kind of real live data that you can base to make sure the methodology works. That's a tough sell. We've got a whole list of VC who are interested in investing in us once we have run this one cell line assay, okay, to find this first combination. 10 million was too much, and now we're at where we could develop a full-on combination drug treatment and sell it and license it, et cetera, for about half that. Now we're not out raising 5 million, it's less than that. But again, I can't say how much because I don't want to get in a jam. Suffice it to say, We have a great roadmap to profitability and a great roadmap. We already have identified big pharma customers and talked with them who are interested in purchasing this first combination treatment. And we just have to produce it. And so I'm spending a lot of time talking with people and having them meet with our team and Norman and doing the fun work of fundraising for a combination for a new biotech venture.
So what's your call to action to anybody who will be watching this back and listening to support you in 3852?
Just shoot us an email and get involved in a conversation, and we'll show you what we've got. And if you're the right kind of investor and you're interested in a great return and making a big difference in the lives of a lot of people and a great ROI, then call us up. We want to find partners with pharma experience to help us license the drug, but we also want to find really good sort of corporate citizens, people who are going to look at this as a trust, basically, of building 3852 into really a high integrity, cutting edge, scientific tech bio company.
Fantastic, Rob. Well, I'll definitely have you back for the other segments that you mentioned. Thank you for your time and your excellent contributions here to Tightens Up today. Any last words you want to leave with everybody?
Thank you very much for the chance and the opportunity. And again, feel free to reach out.
Excellent. Absolutely will do. See you in the next episode. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this episode of Tightens Up today. What did you learn from it? Make sure to drop a comment below with your most valuable insight so that other people can engage in the conversation around what this speaker brought to the table. And then on another front, make sure to subscribe so that every time we drop a new episode, you will be notified. And that way you can keep fueling your dreams and your brain with fresh insights, which can help you along your journey and along your path to your goals. So thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next interview.